Okay, so I was asked to make a presentation just about myself, and I don't like talking about myself for too long. I can do it for a few minutes, but not all the time. So I decided to focus it on a little bit of self-directed research that I've been doing and hoping to pursue going into graduate school. So just going to share some of my knowledge about the health of Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ plus people. So about me. So my name is Riley Kennedy. I am from Niagara and a member of Oneida Nation of the Thames. We'll get into a little bit more details in the following slides. And I am gay and Indigenous. So um, that's been an interesting journey. So my past. So I was born at the Welland Hospital in Niagara and grew up in Denville, Ontario for the first few years of my life, which is this very small rural town near Hamilton and Niagara on the coast of Lake Erie. And the Grand River goes right through it. So that's where I was up, and that's where a lot of my family is from. About near grade 4, we moved to Welland, which is in Niagara, where I attended elementary school and high school in the French immersion program. And when I was in high school, well, I came out started the process of coming out probably in grade 7, I would say. So I was fairly young. And then I had some struggles. So my mom and I reached out to P-Flag Niagara, who offered some support to my family. We became involved with them, helping out with some of their events and doing a bunch of different things with them. Um, Going into high school, I was fairly active. In grade 10, I was tried out for a cheerleading team on one September evening and actually made the team, which was surprising. So I was probably one of the first males on my high school's cheerleading team. And we were fairly successful, winning one of the nationals competitions that year. In grade 11, I planned and organized a conference, went out to the Ministry of Education, focused on LGBTQ youth in Niagara high schools. And we had over 200 attendees from across Niagara. And we partnered with 12 community organizations. And we worked really closely with both the school board and Niagara Region Public Health for that initiative. Through that, I was recommended to be a youth engagement student for Niagara Region Public Health in my grade 12 year. And that's what I did for my grade 12 year. And then I applied to Western, and that's how I got to Western. So when I came to Western, that was what I considered my present. Right now I'm in my university. Um, so I applied to Western for health sciences. Did my first year of health sciences, didn't really like it. Switched over into King's to social work. Didn't like that either. And then finally my second year, I switched into Indigenous studies and community development. So I'm across the campuses. So I'm at Brescia University College for community development and at Western Main Campus for Indigenous studies. Um, throughout my, I'm in my third year, so throughout my 3 years so far, I've done a lot of research. I've been a research assistant in the School of Medicine, working on diabetes management and prevention in Indigenous communities, Indigenous medical education, and most recently, Indigenous environmental health. Um, I've done a lot of things around the university. Probably one of my most involved things, and I'm currently involved in, is the Western University Senate, which is one of the university's governing boards. In that capacity, I advocate a lot. There's a lot of things that the senior administration and that they don't think about when they're putting together policies to bring to the Senate. So I don't speak often, but when I do, it's usually something that I've thought through really well. And I'm also involved in the Indigenous Student Association as their outreach coordinator this year. and I am the undergraduate vice chair for the Global Health Equity Collective, which works for the Center for Research on Health Equity and Social Inclusion. That's my responsibility, is our relationship with them. And right now I'm planning a health equity fellowship program, which will be educating undergraduate students and training them in the field of community-based health equity research. So that's hopefully coming out this summer. Right now, I'm working with Dr. Diana Lewis as a research assistant, part-time, doing working on her data from Pictou Landing First Nation. You can Google that. It's in Nova Scotia, and there's a huge case of environmental contamination of the land surrounding this First Nation that used to be, well, was once all their land, and really important. Their traditional land is really important to them. So she measured how the environmental contamination of this body of water that is close to the First Nation has impacted the health of the community members. So she's done 2 surveys of that in 2014 and 2019, and I'm working on organizing it all and then hopefully moving into analyzing it in this throughout the summer and then into next year. I also just got a new job at the Southwest Aboriginal Health Access Center, where I am working on the Family and Childcare Center, which is going to be London's first Indigenous focused Indigenous or childcare and family center. And I'm working my title is community animator, so my job is to work with the community, families, and children to develop the programs of this new center that's coming in hopefully next year, or well, this year, moving into next year. And then I'm also doing my placement with my sister's place, which just started last week, which is super exciting. So that's what I'm doing right now. In my spare time, when I have spare time, I like going hiking, baking occasionally, traveling. I love to travel. Probably like in my first year, when I had a lot more free time, my mom would never know where I was when I was away at university, just because I was always like heading out to like Sault Ste. Marie for like a week with the school, or like I also went to Cuba in my first year, so I traveled a lot within my first few years of university, and will continue once we're allowed to travel again. So yeah, that's what I enjoy right now. Moving on to my future, so graduating is one of my goals for the next in the next year. I'm hoping to graduate next spring of next year, and then move into graduate studies. So I have a project lined up for me in the epidemiology and biostatistics program at Western through my current supervisor, Dr. Diana Lewis. Looking at her data using longitudinal statistics, which is something they didn't really teach you in undergrad. So I know she's really interested in that. And I said, if you supervise me for a master's, I will do that for my master's project. So that's what we've been developing. I'm going to be developing going into my 4th year and last year as an undergraduate student. And then do that. And then I hope to pursue a PhD at some point. I don't know if it'll be right after my master's, but definitely want to pursue a PhD focused on community-based health research and focused on mobilizing community knowledge of Indigenous Two-Spirit people. So that's what my future holds for me. And then either teaching or going into the nonprofit sector in research assessment and planning. So I like this quote. There's not a lot of quotes about Two-Spirit people. So this quote says, "Christian leaders stand on our soil and claim gay marriage has never occurred here. Over 130 tribes in every region of North America performed millions of same-sex marriages for hundreds of years. Their statements are both hateful and ignorant. Your homosexual was our Two-Spirit people, and we consider them sacred." So we'll get into a little bit more of the history in the next few slides of Two-Spirit people. But this quote kind of spoke to me just because it reinforces that Two-Spirit people have a place in Indigenous societies and broader Canadian society, which is really important. And for me, my identity, um, you know, there's a lot of I would say that decolonization is both a term used for organizations, but also something that people have to do individually. And I would say that I'm still in my journey of decolonization. So um, I'm comfortable with both Two-Spirit and gay, but I don't say Two-Spirit, both because I have to educate people, which I don't really feel comfortable doing as of yet, because I'm still developing my understanding of what that means for myself, and what my responsibilities are when I use that title. So it's a process and I'm working on it. So that's how I fall under that type of spectrum. And I think it's really important to note that a lot of Indigenous people will say that they're part of the LGBTQ community, but not necessarily identify as Two-Spirit just because they haven't taken that journey. They're not ready for that journey. They're in the process of that journey of understanding what that means to be Two-Spirit and incorporate your sexuality with your traditional culture. So now I'm going to talk about Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ health. I separate both of them because what I was talking about in the previous slide is that a lot of Indigenous people don't necessarily identify as Two-Spirit through based on what their stage they're on their life journey. So colonialism and the historical context of Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ health. So I love this quote that I found when I was doing one of my research projects. It says, colonialism has imposed and continues to impose racialized, gendered, and sexualized categories through the assimilation and cultural genocide of Indigenous people. So this kind of summarizes how colonialism has forces binaries and negative stereotypes, negative social norms on Two-Spirit people. And then the ways that it's been done through assimilation and cultural genocide. That's just a really good quote. And then the Indian residential school system in Canada has had a critical impact on the social norms and structures that Indigenous families and communities embrace through the loss of language that has caused much of traditional knowledge on Two-Spirit people to be misplaced. So to explain this, Indigenous peoples use orality to pass down traditions. They're narrative people. So when we have lots of loss of cultural knowledge, it is and lots of people like our older generation dying, we lose a lot of knowledge, and we can see that right now outside of just cultural knowledge through the loss of our languages. As the traditional knowledge seekers start to pass away in their older age, a lot of the young people are struggling to learn their languages. And then the sexual and gender-based violence experienced in Indian residential schools has distorted the views of sexuality, gender, and intimacy. So Indian residential schools directly impacted Indigenous ideas of sexuality, gender, family, children, youth, intimacy, which has had negative effects for women, for Two-Spirit people, for children, for youth, which we can see today with both with Two-Spirit people, but also with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the youth suicides in northern communities and rural communities is directly a direct result of Indian residential schools. So the social determinants of Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ health. So the social determinants of health are social factors that influence an individual's health or a community's health. And there's very broad ones that the Public Health Agency of Canada recognizes and Health Canada recognizes. Then there's more community-specific ones. So Indigenous people have their own set of social determinants of health, but so do Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ people. So yes, they're still affected by all the other ones for the groups that they participate in, but these are some that are unique to and have unique experiences for Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ health. So that's urbanity and mobility. So this describes how a lot of Indigenous LGBTQ people will leave their reservations trying to find community or a safer space to be. And when they reach larger cities like London, like Toronto, um, they'll face different forms of discrimination, racism, being away from their community, still homophobia, even though that's what they're trying to flee. Um, More Eurocentric ways of doing things that are different from their First Nations communities. And mobility is the ability to move from your reservation or your smaller community to a bigger city, because that's a social determinant in itself, is being able to move. Cisnormativity and heteronormativity describes how it's seen as normal in a way to be cisgendered or heterosexual, and that it's almost an ignorance towards people of different genders and people of different sexual orientations, which impacts both general LGBTQ people, but also Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ people. Racism and colonialism really impacts Indigenous people and a lot of other people of color as well. And it's more of a general social determinant of health. Same with homophobia and transphobia, impacts the general LGBTQ community. And then systemic invisibility is probably one of the main ones that is really focused on Two-Spirit people. It talks about how you don't hear in public discourse and in health research in schools and universities, people talking about Two-Spirit people, which is harmful for their health and well-being, because both there's not specific health programs out there for them, for Two-Spirit people, but also it's important to see yourself and to know that you have a place in society in order for you to have good social well-being, which impacts a lot of your other ways of staying well: physical, mental, emotional. So that is a really big one, which I'm hopefully going to address through my future endeavors. So resurgence and reconciliation for Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ people. So decolonizing sexuality and gender, both in Indigenous communities and generally in Canada. So this means rejecting the gender binary, creating safer spaces, listening to Indigenous people and people of color about different understandings of gender and sexuality. Because it was good for Two-Spirit people before colonization. So we have lessons that we can learn from Indigenous people when it comes to creating safer spaces and incorporating inclusive environments for LGBTQ people and people of diverse genders and sexualities. Reclaiming Two-Spirit identity and connecting Indigenous identity to sexual or gender identity. So this is a journey that I'm on right now, but it's also really important for Indigenous youth, Indigenous people to do and to understand. So that's something that I'm working on and that other people are still working on as well. Creating a Two-Spirit community, which is super important. To be able to advocate and have a sense of belonging and community, and including Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ people in public discourse. So, talking about Two-Spirit people in schools, in health research, in nonprofit sectors, in mental health services, just because this is made mainly to reject the systemic invisibility that these people face. And as people not of the Two-Spirit and Indigenous LGBTQ group of people, community, it's important to be allies, and I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to be allies to this group of people. And you may not know what your role is, but I think that the role of an ally is to empower. So it's to create opportunities for the creation of a two-spirit community. It's to mentor and take care of Indigenous LGBTQ youth, so that one day they can become strong and create a community, a two-spirit community. So that's where allyship comes into it. And then here are just some resources. The Cross-Child one is very long. It's a master's thesis, so I do not recommend that for light reading. But the Hunt reading is really good. It's not long at all, and it really summarizes two-spirit health really well. So that's one that I would recommend for further readings. And that's everything. Questions?
Hi, Riley.
Hi.
And Karen. I just really thought you did that awfully well, and it's very interesting. Sometime back when I had mentioned that I belonged to this group, I had mentioned to a friend of mine who's Native about this, and he said, you know, in our culture, those two-spirited people are honored or felt to be special. And I thought, well, that just sounded so good. And,
Yeah.
you know, because that's not really the way it's working in our society, in our, you know, sort of non-Indigenous society. So I think that's something that I really love and admire. And I know it doesn't work for everyone that way if they're not sure. Well, you said yourself, sometimes people may not feel two-spirit, but they know that they're gay and all of that. But I just thought that idea was very lovely. And I'm not sure if you really touched on that, but it felt to me like he was saying a two-spirited person is a special person.
Yeah, so I was talking to one of my teachers who's also Indigenous, and he said that women are related, are the water in Indigenous cultures, and
Right.
men represent fire. And when you combine the two, you get thunder. So that's still for interpretation, but so
very interesting.
that's just what I was taught about two-spirit people.
Very interesting. Do you know the Smokes? Dan
Yes,
Smoke?
I do.
Okay, he's the friend I was talking about. I'm just going to mention to him that I appreciated your talk. He'll be glad to hear that.
Riley, it's Andrew Rosser. I just wanted to echo, I thought that was amazing. And I've had the opportunity to hear a few different two-spirit presentations, but one thing that really stuck out to me was your journey of decolonization yourself. And I think we all have a role to play in that, but it's really interesting to hear from an Indigenous perspective about that, your own journey. So I just want to note, I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah,
Excellent,
I definitely think
Dan.
it's important to recognize that we're all on different journeys as Indigenous people and people as in general. Just because, you know, I'll never know everything that there is about being Indigenous. But I can always try to learn more, which is what I try to do.
Right.
Riley, you know, as a group, our organization reaches out generally to rural and less urban communities than London. And I think you have been trying to do some work yourself in terms of reaching out to the First Nation communities around London. But if you have any suggestions, ideas, hints, things that would help us in terms of reaching out to particularly the three First Nations that border on our community, we would love to hear from you about that. And I'm not sure if you have any ideas or comment in terms of whether the Two-Spirit or LGBTQ people in those communities stay there, or do they emigrate to more urban environments? So I'd just be interested in hearing your comments about
Both.
this.
They do both. Some are still
Yeah.
there. Some have come. I mean, it really, it's all, it's a very, as Riley says, a very personal journey, just like you. It's been a very personal journey for you. It's a very personal. I mean, I do know some people that are still living on Oneida, that don't classify themselves as Two-Spirit. They classify themselves as being gay. It's a safe haven for them there. That's why they haven't come in the city. So it's that's what I've learned having worked with the folks on Oneida.
Yeah, it definitely depends, because when you give up your reserve community, you have to come to the city, which there's a lot more racism in the city, I would say.
Mhm.
So you kind of have to pick your battles, but also on reserves, there can be a lot of homophobia,
Right.
that you face daily. So you kind of have to pick and choose which one you value more.
Yeah.
And there is Indigenous communities, like Indigenous people in urban settings, but it just depends on definitely personal circumstances.
Do you know if drug abuse is high within the LGBTQ community on the reservations? I presume it would be.
Yeah, I find that just from what I've seen talking with some of my friends, is that a lot of people use drug and substance abuse and alcohol abuse as ways to cope with having to hide who you are all the time,
Right.
and facing violence from your family when you do something outside of like a gendered norm. So that's what I've seen for sure in some of my friends.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Well, I wanted to just comment and thank you for your presentation, and certainly I think we all have work to do in the areas of decolonization, and it's certainly not just been the First Nations that have been impacted by that, but because the rest of us have also acquired a lot of learned things that are not helpful, right, and have led to where we are. So we all have a lot to learn, and we really do appreciate your spending some time with us and helping us to continue that journey, for sure.
That was amazing. You left me wanting more, Riley. I'm like, don't stop.
I could have done more too, but I was like, I only have so much time.